Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on another episode of the Educational Leadership Podcast. We have another very special guest. And of course, we have our co-host, Corinne French.
Can't wait to get started in this. We have had a few seconds earlier, and I was like, we got to just start recording. So we got to just get right into this, and we're so glad to do it today.
Yes, so excited. From the beautiful area of San Marcos, we have Dr. Cardona, Superintendent of San Marcos Consolidated ISD. Dr. Cardona, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yes. We know you are so busy as a superintendent. We appreciate your time here. Can you, just so those that are listening in, of course, we have leaders in education from around the great state of Texas. We have community members that tune in just to get to know their leaders in their area. Just if you can, I've read about your profile and your background, and it's been really interesting. Just some of the great things you've done in public education. Could you share a little bit just for those tuning in?
To be short and sweet, I would say I'm not a product of public education. That's one thing that sticks out sometimes. I went to private school, K-12, spent my entire 30-year career in the public education system. So, there's a little bit unique story. I didn't want to be a teacher. I made poor choices in college as an undergraduate. And you know how those things go. And so I went into education through the alternative certification realm. And then I think I had mentioned before, I've been very fortunate to have mentors who really believed, more in me than I believed in myself and the power that I could do. My parents are mentors, obviously, but in the education realm. And so been a middle school principal, high school principal, was fortunate to work with some great teachers and got recruited to go to Houston and work with, the largest system in Texas, and there work with some great principals and community members just to expand academic offerings for middle school kids. And, my belief really is, I don't believe in the word can't. And in a nutshell, it's understanding the stories that each student and their family brings into the educational setting. And then it's not for us to tell them what to do, but for us to support and guide them as they go through their educational journey, and whether they want to go career, military, or college. We like to say here in San Marcos, right? If you're college confident, you're career and military ready. And that's what we've been doing here in San Marcos, is building learner-centered schools with learner-centered leaders. And that requires everybody to have certain skill sets along the way. And for really the community to understand, these are their schools, and, we're just here to support them and their children.
Okay, Gary always has good questions first. And I'm like, sometimes I have to get better at being a podcast co-host and go in right away before he gets in. But you mentioned maybe not making the best choices, and like with maybe your learning in college. I look back at some of my report cards, my parents are sending me things. I'm like, man, I really wasn't that smart. My grades weren't that great, but I think this idea of the learner-centered leaders is what I'm like, I was a leader then, and people noticed that. So even sometimes my grades might not have reflected it, I still was a learner. So what are y'all doing? I'm seeing that beautiful space in the background, and I noticed right away those beautiful colors, and I just have to know what is that we're seeing, and for our listeners that won't be able to see, explain what they're seeing, and then this will also probably be on our YouTube channel so some people can see it. But tell us a little bit about that.
So Rodriguez Elementary School here, the picture in the background is our first school we built from the 2017 bond that I like to think is representative of what, other kids in other communities who you would consider more affluent have as an expectation, right? That was our premise to the community of, if it's good enough for other districts, it's good enough for our kids. And so this school in particular, once it was approved, was in a very unique land situation. And so we, instead of having architects build it for us, we had student groups, and we had our teachers of the year, we had principals of the year, we had our nurses, we had our instructional assistants help us design this building And so I think it's one of the few buildings that has kids in mind, very open hallways. It has individual cubicles for kids. It has group setting spaces for kids. It has classrooms can be combined. It has the feel of San Marcos here with the river and how we believe that, we're the gateway to the hill country and how we respect the environment. And so this build, you can see the colors, and the library itself is the hub of the school. So kids are always walking through the library. This is the top floor. The bottom floor has the GT space, the STEM space, the maker spaces underneath. So the library for us was the central hub, and we want our kids to be literate and numerate. So like, this is the pride and joy of San Marcos. Like, we believe this is what all our buildings now should look like in the future. And it's become the standard. And the best year board member, Corinne, the best compliment I got when we opened this building was a pretty conservative board member at the time said, "I understand your vision now. I get it." And so I think that's the best compliment that you could pay. Is that it was designed by teachers, by students, it wasn't designed by central office administrators. So it's very kid-centric.
Yeah, it's very interesting how you're describing it. I came from outside of public education. I came, part of the business world, basically. Now, obviously, there's business involved in public education, just a different type of business. Speaking of, you mentioned the bond in 2017, and in Texas, as you know, Texas had the worst bond election in a decade this past year. And now, when people in a community members or leaders in public education, there's some big numbers that come out for these bonds for new schools and renovations and that sort of thing. Obviously, a lot of thought is put into those schools, at least in your schools, on how to improve the academic performance and the learning environment and that sort of thing. What are some things, or maybe there's not a way, if there is, please share. I mean, is there a way to look at a bond package and say, okay, this is needed for academics, and this is this really needed or not needed? I mean, because there's these big numbers, hundreds of millions of dollars that come out. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
If we figure that out, on this podcast, we both need to become millionaires. So,
taxpayer money, when you start talking about taxpayer money, I think you have to open up yourself first to be very transparent to the community. And there's wants and then there's needs. And so our board members here, nominated 3 people to be on our planning committee, our bond advisory committee. And so, we had people that were for public education, and we had some that were, anti-tax and very vocal in what they thought. And so I think this process, what was interesting is coming from Houston, the community has such a big play in Houston ISD. So the first meeting here, I didn't say a word. And then the community members got mad because I didn't explain the academic vision. And they said, it's our job to make your vision become a reality. But they were very cognizant of what we could do and what we needed and what we wanted. And so at the end of the day, after our 40 plus meetings and all that, even those people who are anti-taxing or anti-bond at least said, we're not going to be negative. We're not going to go against you. We're just not going to vote for this one way or the other, which we took as a win, that they felt that we were putting buildings in place that were needed, not just, Taj Mahals. There was a stigma here from an athletic facility, that we had to overcome. But this elementary school that's behind me, by the way, came $1 million under budget and on time.
Good job. So, wonderful. That's a big deal. Congratulations.
Yeah. So
that's a really big deal.
Open right as the pandemic is starting. So I think that bodes well for the future of us, that people will look and say, their entire bond package came in right now about $5.2 million under budget. We've defeased, we've paid down debt early during this process. We've, obviously the laws change for finance. And so we've lowered our tax rates, but we've also been able to defease payments and save taxpayers money. And I think that will help us in the future, but it's done because we're very transparent. And we don't ask for anything we don't necessarily need for kids and for academics. They know it's not, the superintendent's $100 million football stadium that he wants to legacy project. It's what the kids need. It's not what administration needs.
Go ahead, Corinne.
Well, I'm just going to say, so congratulations, because I've been on my school board for 10 years. And I know that we only have passed one bond, one failed, one passed in my 10-year history. And it was really hard. It was hard on my family. I mean, but I love what you said about if someone just doesn't believe or wants to pass the bond, they still have a right to, I wanted them still to come and vote, because at that point we weren't in a place, so it was at large. And I just want you to show up. I really want you to show up at the polls, because this is your community, and this is the closest I think the tax dollars ever go. This can go right here. And sometimes it just gets all through the state, and public ed finance is really hard to understand. And I think that may be where my next question, I'm just going to say something for a minute and then maybe comment on it. I'm not sure if there's a question here, but I think that's the hard thing about Texas public school finance, bonds. Why can't we just pay teachers more? Why can't we just stop doing this? There are so many moving parts to public ed. And so I think maybe my question is, with all of that happening, so many plates in the air, how do you stay focused, and how do you stay encouraged, and how do you stay the course? If that's like an okay question to ask, because it's hard right now. And for context, we're in the middle of, I feel like we're coming out of a global pandemic, but it was a really hard year and a half, 2 years, going on 2 years for public ed, for the entire planet. So how are you staying focused and encouraged now?
Well, I learned from some mentors, and it took me a long time, because, we all have that, I think Harvard calls it FOPO, F-O-P-O, fear of other people's opinions. We live in this state of always thinking about what other people may think positively or negatively about us. But I finally had some mentors say that, you got to think about kids, number one. All your policy decisions have to be around kids, regardless of, the bullets you're going to take over the last 2 years and what's going on currently. And ultimately, I learned I don't take criticism from people I really would never take advice from. That took me a long time to really understand that. And, I am a political science major from A&M. And so I fundamentally believe that people have a right to voice their opinions, to dissent, to vote against the process. I believe in the democratic process. I do also believe, it's my responsibility to remain as calm as possible, to shield the teachers and administrators from that turbulence. And I always remind them as I'm in classrooms, how much I appreciate what it is that they're doing, right? I'm sure they appreciate what I'm doing, but we're tied together as a system. And if I'm not functioning very well, the teachers and administrators are not going to function. And if they're not functioning well, then it's going to affect me too. And so I think we've have a really good relationship here in San Marcos, where, we can look at the outside politics, but 95% of our staff members will stay the course. And we know that 5%, we know who they are. And it's not because they're not entitled, they are entitled to, but I have anxiety. I know they have anxiety. And so we just have to kind of guide them through, and then eventually they'll come around, or if they don't, then they don't. And that's just the way, as long as they're still good for kids, then it's not my personal belief to interfere with a great teacher, whether I agree with them or not. If they're great for kids, they're great for kids. And I just think we have a very transparent and open system here in San Marcos, and that involves the board. I mean, I don't necessarily politically agree with all the board members. And in many cases, I don't. But I will say that this board is 100% behind doing what is best for students and staff. to take that learner-centered approach. We're very in tune with that. Now, their own political things that they get involved in, they know I stay out of that and as much as I can. And they're politicians, and I respect that. You know, I can't hold them. I don't hold them accountable for anything. They're held accountable by the electorate. And that's what I tell people that want to complain about a board member. I said, well, if you want to run. You know, they're doing a job. They're not getting paid. They're serving this community. And if you don't like it, then there's a process for voting them in or out. But they're entitled to do what it is they want because the majority voted them in to let them have that platform. So
you could tell just from what you're describing right now with your district and the board, and that you're all about transparency. You're all about communicating, look, here's the situation. And it's refreshing to hear, because I don't know if communities always see that. And I definitely think it makes a difference. Even when you're describing, you just said it straight out in the open here. You don't always agree. You don't agree, but y'all are open to having conversations about it and not pretending like everything is perfect. And that's really when innovation happens, is when you got different opinions, different backgrounds, different experiences, diversity, just sharing different perspectives, and that's how you grow. And now you've been described as the turnaround. I forget what the word was on your profile. As far as turning around schools, turning around. But it sounds like a lot of that probably has to do with communication, just being transparent and listening, right? And I think that's over half of the communication is just listening, right?
Yeah. Well, I used to tell kids as a high school principal and middle school principal, right? You have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use your ears twice as much as you use that mouth. So, I mean, yeah, it's listening. I think people just want to be validated. You know, there are always people you can't make happy one way or another with the decisions that you make, but whether you're a child nutrition worker, whether you're a maintenance worker, transportation worker, a teacher, principal, you know, people want to feel valued. And just me growing up, you know, not a lot of people know that my father was a custodian in a school district in San Antonio. And so he was terminated by a school board for not working fast enough. And I watched that happen, you know, as a middle school kid, watch my dad get terminated by a board in a district that I would later become an award-winning principal in, right? But I watched that happen. And so, you know, that weighs on you when you're growing up and how you treat people, because at that point I felt like they didn't listen to him. You know, my dad had been hit by a drunk driver when he was younger and was in a coma for 30 days. And there was no ADA then. You know, there was no Americans with Disabilities Act. He would have had protections nowadays, but you still observe those things. And so, you know, now that I have a system that I work with board members, you know, I'd like to think that I may not agree with all employees, but at the end of the day, if something happens, they're at least going to feel like they were heard and valued. And we may not agree on certain things, but they are going to be listened to. And if we mess up, and we occasionally do, if school systems messed up, then we fix it. And then we move on and try and value our people, because there's so many more people, teachers and or other staff members. There's one superintendent and maybe 4 or 5 cabinet members. So, you know, you have to work with everybody to move the entire system forward for kids.
Every time we have a podcast, I keep thinking that it can't get better. Like, I can't be more encouraged. Our guests won't be any more encouraged. And then today you're talking, one of the things I loved, you said tied together as a system. You protect and honor your teachers and your staff, because they're in the classroom, they need to do the work. And also love what you said about not taking criticism from those that you wouldn't take advice, but still honoring everyone in the process. I mean, to me, that's like true leadership. It's just, you are here, your voice matters. But as a trustee, for me, I am not like, it's not popular vote. I'm trusted with something, and I'm going to make a good decision. As the superintendent, you have to lead, and you have to balance that the board, and then what your staff needs. And so you just summarized something so beautiful. And I never think that we can have a better podcast than the one that we had prior, but now this has been so good. I know Gary probably has another question, and time is short, but do you have some big dreams for Texas public students? We have 5.5 of them. They're watching us. They need our leadership. What are some of your big dreams for them?
Well, my biggest dream would be to do something about this accountability system, because I mentioned earlier, I was a private school kid, and, I don't understand. I don't envy teachers and administrators who have to sit before children and tell them that they're not worthy of moving on, or that some assessment dictates a potential life path for a kid. When in private school, I never had that. No one ever sat me down and said,
wow,
you're not worthy of this. At the end of the day, I took the ACT, the SAT, Iowa Test of Basic Skills, but, we were supported and nurtured in that environment. And, so my dream is eventually to get rid of, in the perfect world, get rid of this accountability system, not to not have metrics. We have metrics, career pathways, certifications, military readiness, college readiness. We already know what the end goal is. But I think this system that we use is a flawed system. And, I always ask this question of politicians. I said, we're required by law to report abusive systems. If we think something is happening,
right,
an abuse to a child or an adult, but what do you do when it's the system causing the abuse, right? Who do you report that to, right? We all know, you're a board president, you've heard stories from parents and from teachers about getting physically ill,
right,
before these exams, like throwing up and all these other things. And that's an abusive system.
it is.
And, it doesn't measure anything. Colleges and universities, to my knowledge, do not say, what are your STAR scores? And so we just, choice is a big word nowadays, and yet it doesn't seem to be a choice not to use this assessment system that we know doesn't work. And it doesn't measure what kids can or can't do. And I just think it's a hindrance for the 5.5 million students in the state of Texas.
It is. Oh, yes.
Yeah, this has been an interesting podcast. This is a different perspective than I think we've heard before. And it just is a reminder of all the elements that go into public education, the learning environment, the communication, the metrics and the standards that are set. Hopefully for those that have been tuning in, now you're thinking about things just maybe a little bit different than you did before you started listening. Maybe a lot different than you did before. But before we close out, I just want to say thank you, Dr. Cardona, for being on the podcast.
I appreciate y'all having me. This is therapy for me. Y'all don't realize that, y'all learn something, but for us, it's kind of therapeutic. And so I think the services that you all provide for us is really helpful. And this French here, thank you for your service as a board president. It's a thankless job, and we appreciate. I know there are many of us who appreciate our board members, who hold the line for us and who challenge us and want us to do what's best for our kids.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you both, and thank you for your time. And before we close out, we're going to give a shout out to our sponsor, Ideal Impact. Ideal Impact is a faith-based organization that's giving funding to schools and churches. Over 700 churches in Texas, over 162 schools in Texas, giving $1.5 billion by optimizing the systems that use energy that schools already have. They're not trying to sell an air conditioning system. And so they're optimizing, helping districts be good stewards of tax dollars and using technology to do that. Thank you, Ideal Impact. And thank you all for those that have been tuning in to the Educational Leadership Podcast.
Thank you.